Welcome to the Unseen Whispers, where the stories linger long after the night fades. Before we dive into tonight's chilling tale, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because some stories feel different in the dead of night. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Story 1. The Old House in the Woods. The dense trees towered overhead like a living canopy, their thick twisting roots clawing into the earth beneath. The only sounds were the creaking of branches and the distant chirping of unseen birds. A thick fog clung to the forest floor, shifting and curling like tendrils that reached up to the ankles of the hikers. Every step they took seemed to sink deeper into the maze of wilderness that seemed endless. Samantha pulled the hood of her jacket tighter over her head, glancing at the others. "This is not right," she muttered, glancing back the way they had come. But there was nothing, no sign of the familiar trail they had been following earlier that day. The map, she realized with a sinking heart, was useless. Their phones had no signal. Every direction looked the same: dark, twisted trees and more fog. Her companions, David, Mark, and Laura, were silent. They had all been trying to keep their nerves under control, but it was hard to ignore the growing feeling of dread that pressed against them like the oppressive fog. The hike, once full of excitement and laughter, had turned into a nightmare. "This isn't right," David echoed her thoughts, his voice low but tinged with panic. "We've been walking in circles for hours." Mark, always the optimist, gave a strained laugh. "We'll find our way out. Let's keep going." But Samantha wasn't so sure. Every instinct told her to turn around, but the path was unfamiliar. It was as if the forest itself was trapping them, guiding them deeper into its tangled heart. They had ventured off the main trail earlier in the day, when curiosity led them to a small creek, but now the trees felt too close. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the land itself was watching them. Samantha's eyes scanned the horizon. There was no sign of any path ahead, just more dense forest. Then, something caught her attention. A flicker of movement, a glimpse of something in the distance. "Wait," she called out, pointing ahead. "Do you see that?" The others stopped. At first they didn't notice anything, but then, through the trees, they saw it too. A silhouette, a shadow against the mist. Something unnatural, a house. It was small, isolated, barely visible through the dense fog, but it was there. A structure, its shape distorted and faint, and in that moment they all felt it, the strange pull, the unexplainable sense that this was their salvation. "We should go check it out," Laura said, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with a desperate hope. "Maybe we can find shelter there. Maybe it's not too far from a town." None of them could argue. The forest felt like it was closing in around them, and the house offered something that the wilderness did not: hope. With renewed determination, they trudged forward, eager to find a safe place away from the encroaching fog. But as they drew closer to the house, an uneasy silence fell over them. The air grew colder, and the sound of their footsteps seemed muffled, as though they were being swallowed by the earth beneath them. They reached the house, and at first glance it seemed normal, too normal. The wood was weathered, the roof sloping gently to one side, but it wasn't dilapidated. It wasn't decayed. It was as if time itself had forgotten it existed. "Hello?" Samantha called out hesitantly, her voice echoing strangely, as if the house itself was swallowing the sound. No answer. David tested the door, and it creaked open with an unsettling ease, like an invitation. The inside was dark but perfectly still. There was no dust, no sign of decay. The furniture sat where it should, an old worn couch facing a stone fireplace, a wooden table surrounded by chairs, everything in pristine condition, as though the house had been frozen in time. "This is weird," Mark said, stepping inside first. "Where are the cobwebs? The mold?" The others followed suit, and as they stepped over the threshold, a wave of cold air seemed to rush past them, almost like the house had exhaled a long-held breath. Laura shivered. "Do you think anyone still lives here?" Samantha was already scanning the room, her eyes narrowing. The air felt thick, charged with something unnatural. "No," she said, "but I don't think we should stay." But it was too late. The door slammed shut behind them with an almost deafening thud. As they turned to face the door, the silence settled back into the house, a suffocating presence that pressed in on them. The air felt colder now, and as Samantha looked around the room, she noticed something else. The walls seemed to be closing in. "We need to leave," Samantha repeated, her voice rising in urgency. "Now!" "Why?" "It's just a house," David said, trying to calm her, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "We can figure out what's going on, but we don't need to panic." She didn't trust it. There was something off about the house, something that made her skin crawl. It wasn't just the eerie stillness. It was the fact that everything seemed too perfect, too undisturbed. The fireplace was cold, yet there were faint traces of ash at the base. The chairs were in perfect alignment, but the table was oddly bare, with no sign of dust. The floorboards creaked underfoot, yet there were no marks, no sign of wear. David moved toward a window and pulled the curtain aside. Outside, nothing had changed. The fog lingered, thick and oppressive, obscuring any view of the forest beyond. "We're not getting out, are we?" Laura asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Samantha said quietly, her heart racing now. "The house isn't letting us." Before she could say anything more, the temperature seemed to plummet even further. Her breath fogged in the air, and the room grew darker, shadows deepening unnaturally. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming, and the others began to notice it too. David looked back at the door. "This isn't funny. Why would someone lock us in here?" But there was no one at all. Then came the whispers, low at first, barely audible, just a faint rustling in the corners of the room. But as they turned to look, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. "Get out, get out." The words, chilling and guttural, echoed through the walls, and each syllable felt like an assault on their minds. Samantha clutched her head, feeling a sudden surge of vertigo. She stumbled, unable to steady herself. "They're here?" Mark gasped, his face pale. He was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. It's the house. It's alive." Laura's breath quickened. "What do we do?" But Samantha, too frightened to speak, had already moved toward the back door. She reached out and touched the knob. Nothing. With a sound that was part groan, part scream, the walls of the house seemed to close in tighter. The air was suffocating, the walls closing in on them with malicious intent. The house was alive, and it was angry. Panic set in as the walls seemed to close in on them, an unseen force pressing down on their chests. Samantha's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled back from the door, her hands clawing at the walls, looking for a way out. "Help!" she shouted, but her voice felt swallowed by the thick silence, muffled and distant. David was still trying the door, pulling at the handle with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. There was no creaking of hinges, no resistance at all, just a heavy, unnatural stillness. It was as if the house itself had become a living entity, resisting every attempt to escape. "Why won't it open?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. His eyes darted around the room, his pulse quickening with each passing second. Something's wrong. Something's really wrong. Samantha's heart raced as she turned toward the others, her thoughts swirling in a haze of panic. "We need to stay calm, okay? Panicking is only making it worse. Let's try to figure out what's going on." But her voice trembled with the weight of her own fear, and deep down, she knew there was no logic to the situation. Something far beyond their understanding was happening here. The room grew colder, and suddenly, the air felt thick with an electric charge. It was as if the house itself was breathing, its ancient wooden beams creaking in sync with their rapid heartbeats. Then, as if answering her unspoken fears, the whispers returned, louder now, crawling through the air like insects in her ears. "Leave, leave, leave." The walls seemed to groan in agreement, and as Samantha turned, her eyes caught something in the far corner of the room, a shadow that hadn't been there before. It was tall and elongated, its edges blurry as if it were half-formed, like a dark silhouette that couldn't quite exist in the realm of reality. Before she could speak, the shadow surged forward, its form rippling like smoke, and in an instant it was gone. But its presence lingered, a cold, unnatural chill crawling along her spine. Then came the vision. The room around her shifted, its walls stretching, distorting. It was like watching the world through a broken lens, everything sliding in and out of focus. The air grew thick and heavy, and the faint scent of decay filled her nose. Samantha blinked, disoriented. When her eyes opened again, she was no longer in the house. Instead, she found herself standing in a wide, empty field, an eerie, moonlit landscape. And standing before her was something that made her blood run cold. A woman, or what had once been a woman. Her eyes were hollow, her skin a sickly gray, and her hands outstretched toward Samantha with a grotesque, unnerving smile. "Join us," the woman whispered, in a voice that echoed with 1,000 other voices, each one cold and filled with despair. Samantha stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat, but the woman followed, her twisted form floating above the ground like a specter. With every step, the air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, their voices mutating into a chorus of tortured souls. "We never leave. We never leave." Samantha turned to run, but her legs felt heavy, like she was moving through thick mud. The woman's eyes never left her, and the cold began to suffocate her, pressing against her chest until it was hard to breathe. Suddenly, there was a flash, bright, blinding light. Samantha gasped, her vision snapping back to the house. She was standing in the same living room, surrounded by the others. They were staring at her, wide-eyed, their faces pale and drawn with fear. "Sam, what just happened?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. Samantha couldn't answer. She was gasping for air, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she clutched her chest. Her heart pounded like a drum, and every inch of her body was on high alert. "They know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They're not just ghosts. They were once like us. They were trapped here, and they don't leave." Before the others could react, the temperature in the room dropped even further. Samantha's breath came out in visible puffs, and the house groaned, its walls shuddering as if preparing for something even worse. It was no longer just the whispers that haunted the air. The house itself seemed to be alive, pulsing with dark energy. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and every crack in the walls seemed to tremble, vibrating with an unseen force. David's hand was still on the door handle, his knuckles white with strain. "It's not moving," he gritted out, frustration lining his voice. "What the hell is happening here?" Samantha shook her head, her mind still reeling from the vision. She couldn't shake the image of the woman, her hollow eyes and outstretched hands. The chilling whisper, "Join us," echoed in her ears, driving her nearly mad. It wasn't just a vision. It felt like a warning, a promise. "We have to get out of here," she repeated, her voice more forceful now, though doubt twisted in her gut. The truth was becoming clearer with every passing second. The house wasn't just trapping them physically. It was toying with their minds. It was feeding off their fear, using them as vessels for its malevolent energy. "Maybe there's another way out," Mark suggested weakly. "A window? An attic?" But as he said this, the room grew even colder, and the walls seemed to warp again, distorting like reflections in a broken mirror. For a split second, Samantha saw something in the corner of her vision, a shadow darting past the doorway. "No," she whispered, a sinking feeling in her stomach. "The house is alive. We can't escape. Not like this." Suddenly the walls trembled again, and the faintest sound, a long hollow ringing, echoed from deep within the house. It was a sound that made their skin crawl, a sickening resonance that seemed to rattle their bones. "What the hell is that?" Laura gasped, clutching Samantha's arm as if for protection. The walls groaned louder now, and then, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, a door appeared, a door that had not been there moments before. It was old, rusted, and ancient-looking, as if it had been concealed within the house's foundations for centuries. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural energy, and the moment Samantha laid eyes on it, she felt a force pulling her toward it. Before she could stop herself, her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her toward the door. "No! Sam!" David called, reaching out for her, but his voice was drowned out by the overwhelming hum of energy coming from the door. She couldn't resist. She couldn't stop herself. Her hand reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling, and then she turned it. The moment Samantha's fingers closed around the cold, rusted doorknob, a sharp, icy sensation coursed through her body. Her heart skipped a beat as the door creaked open with an unnatural slowness, like it hadn't been touched in centuries. Behind it was a long, narrow hallway, dimly lit by flickering candles set into the walls. The air was thick with dust, but it was the smell that made her stomach turn, a rotting, decaying stench, like something long forgotten. "Samantha, no!" David cried, his voice raw with panic as he grabbed her arm. "Don't open it. We don't know what's on the other side." But Samantha's body seemed no longer her own. Her hand, despite her own desperate attempts to pull away, was firmly gripped on the door handle. A force stronger than her fear was pulling her forward, I. Her voice caught in her throat as the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. Come closer. Her vision blurred, the edges of her consciousness slipping away as her body took another step forward into the corridor. The others shouted behind her, but their voices were drowned out, swallowed by the dark whispers. With a deep, echoing sigh, the door slammed shut behind them. The sound vibrated in the house, and for a moment, everything felt still, suffocatingly so. Then the temperature plummeted, colder than before, colder than the house had ever felt. The air around them grew oppressive, thick with some dark force that weighed on their chests like a lead blanket. The hallway stretched impossibly far, the walls leaning inward, narrowing with each passing second. But Samantha could no longer think. Her mind was a haze, the presence in the house pushing everything but the primal need to keep moving deeper into the house, into its heart. "Sam!" Mark shouted, his voice shaky. "Come back! This isn't real! You're not yourself!" But Samantha couldn't hear him. All she could hear was the chorus of whispers, each one growing louder, more insistent. "Join us! Join us!" The others were shouting now, trying to pull her away, but it was as if the house had claimed her. The closer she moved down the corridor, the more she could feel the temperature shift. The walls, once solid, seemed to ripple and pulse like a living, breathing entity. The house was alive, and it was feeding on them. Suddenly, the corridor opened up into a vast circular room. The floor was made of ancient stone, covered in strange, indecipherable symbols carved into the surface. Candles flickered all around, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. And in the center of the room, there was something terrifying. A figure. It was tall, skeletal, draped in tattered black robes. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its presence filled the room, radiating an intense, palpable malice. It was as if it was the source of the house's power, and in its hands, it held a long, ancient staff, which it slowly raised as it turned toward Samantha. "You've come," the figure rasped, its voice like the groaning of ancient wood. "We have waited." The others caught up to her, but the moment they stepped into the room, they were frozen, paralyzed by some unseen force. They couldn't move, couldn't speak. Samantha felt their fear, but it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. The figure slowly advanced toward her, its skeletal hand outstretched, and with every step it took, the air grew heavier, thicker, until Samantha felt like she couldn't breathe. "It's time," the figure intoned, its voice a low, rumbling growl. "Time to join the others." Suddenly, the room shifted again, distorted, twisting, like a nightmare trying to escape from the edges of her mind. And then the ground beneath them began to tremble, vibrating as the house seemed to come alive with a violent force. The symbols on the floor began to glow, an eerie green light that seeped into Samantha's skin, burning her from the inside. Her vision blurred, her thoughts spinning as the whispers grew louder, their voices like a million screams layered upon each other. Then came the realization. The figure was not just a figure, it was a prisoner, one of the many souls trapped here, trapped in this house. And now she was the next. "No!" Samantha screamed, her voice raw as she tried to pull away from the figure, but it was too late. The energy swirling around the room pulled at her, grabbing her body and soul, dragging her closer to the figure, closer to her doom. Behind her, the others were struggling, trying to break free from the paralyzing force that held them. But the figure was unstoppable. "It's your turn now," the figure rasped, its bony fingers reaching out for her. With a cry of desperation, Samantha managed to tear herself away, throwing herself backward as the figure lunged. She collided with the stone floor, her skin burning with the house's energy. But it wasn't enough. The pull was too strong, and then, in an instant, everything went black. When Samantha opened her eyes again, the room had changed. The figure was gone. The others were beside her, their faces pale and wide-eyed, as if they too had been dragged into the same nightmare. But something was different. Something had shifted in the house. Samantha's body felt heavier now, like her very soul was tethered to the house, to the darkness that lived inside its walls. She could still hear the whispers. No, they could hear her now, whispering not just in her mind, but in the very fabric of her being. "You're one of us now." "No," she whispered, feeling her strength begin to slip away, the house slowly absorbing her into its cursed heart. We need to get out," Laura gasped, her voice filled with panic. "We have to leave." But it was too late. The floor beneath them split open, and from the cracks shadowy tendrils emerged, reaching out to claim them, to drag them into the house's eternal prison. It was a trap. "No!" Samantha screamed as she reached for David. "Run! Get out!" But the tendrils had already grabbed him, pulling him down into the depths of the house, and his screams echoed as the darkness consumed him. Mark and Laura were next. Samantha could see them, their eyes wide with terror, as they were pulled into the shadows, their bodies writhing as they vanished into the dark abyss. And then there was only silence. Samantha was alone. The house was still, as if nothing had ever happened. But she could feel it now, the curse wrapping around her soul, suffocating her with its dark power. "You are ours now." The voice was no longer distant. It was inside her, part of her. And as she stood there, broken and lost, the house whispered again, the final words filling her mind with dread. "We wait for the next to come." Days, weeks, months passed. The forest remained unchanged. The house stood, silent and waiting. And somewhere, lost in the maze of trees, a new group of hikers ventured closer to the house, unaware of the darkness that lay within. The house would remain undisturbed, its dark history preserved by the souls it had consumed. Forever. Julia had always felt that something was off about the old apartment complex. It wasn't just the creaky floors or the faint musty smell that seemed to linger in the hallways. It was the silence, the kind of oppressive, choking silence that never felt quite right. The building, nestled at the edge of the city, seemed to hold 1,000 secrets behind its cracked walls. But Julia had learned to ignore the oddities, until one evening she heard it. It started with the scratching. At first it was faint, a sound like fingernails dragging across drywall. Julia had assumed it was a rodent. The apartment next door had been vacant for weeks, the previous tenant suddenly gone without a trace, and the landlord had mentioned that the place was supposed to be getting renovated. But the scratching didn't stop after the first night. It continued every evening, growing louder and more frantic, as if something or someone was trying to claw its way out. Julia tried to ignore it at first, but it gnawed at her, keeping her awake in the dark. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard it, scratching, whispers, and sometimes a low thud, as though something heavy had fallen. It was as if the apartment next door had become a living entity, restless and agitated. One night, after hours of tossing and turning, Julia couldn't take it any longer. She decided to investigate. She slid out of bed, grabbing the flashlight from her nightstand. Quietly, she made her way down the hallway, the beam of light cutting through the gloom. The apartment door next to hers was dark, but she could hear something now. A distinct thumping sound, like something or someone pounding against the walls. Her breath quickened. There was something wrong about it, something in the air that made her skin crawl. She hesitated in front of the door. It wasn't locked. Without thinking, she turned the knob and stepped inside. The air inside the vacant apartment was heavy with dust. Julia's flashlight flickered as she moved further into the room, its beam dancing across faded wallpaper and empty furniture. The sound of scratching had stopped, but the eerie silence was somehow worse. Then she saw it. In the middle of the floor, crumpled and contorted in an unnatural position, lay a figure, a woman. Julia's heart slammed against her chest, her breath catching in her throat as she stepped closer. The woman's form was translucent, an ethereal figure twisted in agony, her body frozen in a state of torment. Her face was a mask of horror, eyes wide and pleading, as though she were trapped in some unfathomable pain that would never end. Julia's hands trembled as she lowered the flashlight, her voice barely a whisper as she called out, "Hello? Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. It couldn't. Instead, Julia noticed something far worse, an imprint on the floor beneath the woman's body, a stain that was darker than any shadow could cast. The woman's limbs were twisted, as if she had been trapped in that agonizing position for an eternity. But there was no blood, no wound, only the smell of something foul and decayed. Julia backed away, terror crawling up her spine. Her thoughts raced. What had happened to her? Why was she here? The woman's face, although pale and ghostly, seemed to shimmer in the flashlight's glow. For a brief moment, Julia thought she saw her mouth twitch, just a flicker, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a chill of dread through her. Julia stepped back in shock, nearly tripping over a chair as she fumbled for the door. As she turned to leave, her mind raced. Was this some kind of hallucination? A dream? But then, a voice, soft, barely audible, whispered from the corner of the room, "Help me." Julia's breath hitched. The voice was a woman's, the same woman lying contorted on the floor. Julia left the apartment in a daze, her heart hammering in her chest. She locked the door behind her and stood in the hallway for a long time, her mind reeling. The woman's desperate plea echoed in her mind. Help me. She had to know what was going on. The building had been around for decades, but who had lived in that apartment before? Julia couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled upon something far darker than she could comprehend. The next day, she went to the landlord's office. Mr. Grayson, the elderly man who managed the building, was hunched over his desk, scribbling in a ledger. His glasses were perched at the tip of his nose, and he looked up at Julia with a mixture of annoyance and apathy. "Something wrong, Miss Hale?" he asked, barely glancing up from his paperwork. "I need to know about the previous tenant in apartment 3B, Julia said, her voice tight. Her name was Sarah. The landlord's eyes narrowed. "Sarah? Yes, well, She was one of the ones who left suddenly. His tone turned more serious, almost guarded. There's nothing of concern, Miss Hale. Just a personal matter. You should leave it be. But Julia wasn't easily deterred. What happened to her? She pressed. Mr. Grayson sighed and set his pen down. You're asking about things that are better left forgotten, he muttered, almost as if he were speaking to himself. But if you must know, Sarah, she didn't leave on her own terms. Julia's pulse quickened. What do you mean? The landlord hesitated. You should be careful, Miss Hale. The building, it's got its own history. That night, unable to shake the unease that had settled in her bones, Julia searched the apartment building's archives. She discovered that Sarah had lived in the apartment for years, but there were no records of her leaving, no forwarding address, nothing. The building's history was riddled with strange disappearances, unexplained deaths, and unsettling events. Some tenants had even left in the dead of night, never to be heard from again. Julia's research eventually led her to a disturbing legend. The building was said to be cursed. A malevolent force, hungry for souls, had taken root in the structure decades ago. The spirits of its victims, people who had lived there, were trapped in a cyclical torment, unable to escape. The curse claimed every tenant, one by one, until the building was full of lost souls, wandering in a limbo of pain and despair. Julia realized that Sarah wasn't just a ghost. She was cursed, trapped by the very building she had once called home. The scratches, the whispers, the thuds. They were Sarah's cries for help, trying to reach out to anyone who could hear her. But there was no way to break the curse, no escape. And then Julia understood the terrible truth. The curse wasn't just about Sarah. It was about everyone who lived in the building. Once you moved in, you became part of the cycle. The curse would slowly, inevitably claim you. And once you were claimed, you'd become one of the wandering spirits, trapped forever. As days passed, the strange occurrences in Julia's apartment escalated. The noises grew louder, more persistent. Her nightmares were filled with the image of Sarah, contorted and pleading, trapped between worlds. Julia could feel the curse closing in on her, tightening its grip like a noose around her throat. It wasn't long before the voices began to speak to her directly. Help me. Help me. You're next, they would whisper, echoing through her apartment. Every night she could feel the presence of something watching her, waiting for her to break. The moment of reckoning came on a stormy night. Julia couldn't take it anymore. She knew there was no escape. The curse was too strong, and she was too far gone. She returned to the vacant apartment, flashlight in hand, trembling with fear. She needed to see Sarah again, needed to understand the torment that had trapped her. But when Julia stepped inside, she saw something worse than she could have imagined. The room had changed. It was no longer empty. The walls were covered with scratches, deep raw gouges, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Sarah was standing in the center of the room now, her form fully visible. Her once anguished face was now a mask of silent rage. Her body had changed, no longer contorted in pain, but twisted into something darker, something more malevolent. And then Julia saw it, the truth. Sarah wasn't alone. The walls were crawling with the spirits of every tenant who had ever lived in the building. Their eyes were wide with fear, their bodies slack and lifeless, but they were all watching her. Julia screamed. the curse had claimed her too. Julia's apartment, like every other before it, was soon abandoned. The building sat in silence, its halls echoing with the whispers of the lost souls that roamed its corridors. No one knew what had happened to Julia, or Sarah, or the others. The landlord, Mr. Grayson, moved away, leaving the building to decay. But the curse remained. And soon, another tenant would move in, drawn by the strange allure of the old forgotten complex. And the cycle would begin again. Dr. Adam Carter stood at the entrance of the long-abandoned hospital, the dilapidated building looming ahead, its broken windows and crumbling brickwork giving it an eerie, forgotten quality. It had been years since the hospital had been shut down, long enough for the rumors about its haunted past to fade into whispers. Adam had been assigned to work the night shift, a rookie fresh out of medical school, eager to prove himself. What better place than the infamous St. Margaret's Hospital to start his career? After all, it was known for its advanced medical programs before it was inexplicably closed. The hospital was located on the outskirts of town, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. Despite its decaying exterior, the place seemed oddly pristine on the inside. Adam was greeted by an old receptionist at the front desk, who didn't seem surprised to see him. "You're the new doctor, right?" the receptionist asked, her voice almost a whisper. Her pale face barely registered any expression, though her eyes flickered with something Adam couldn't quite place. "Yeah, I'm Dr. Adam Carter," he replied, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. "I'm here for my first shift." "Of course," she said. "Room 213. There are a few patients waiting." Adam nodded and made his way toward the hallway, the faint hum of the lights, the only sound breaking the silence of the hospital. He passed rows of empty rooms, their doors ajar, some showing signs of wear and neglect. But what unnerved him the most was how the air seemed too thick, as though something was pressing down on him. His first patient was waiting for him. As Adam entered room 213, he found a man lying on the examination table, his face obscured by a bandage. The man groaned softly, his body twitching with painful spasms. "Mr. Larson?" Adam asked, taking a seat beside the bed. The man nodded weakly. "Can you tell me what happened?" Adam inquired, scanning the man's chart. There were no clear notes on his injuries, only cryptic references to the incident. The man tried to speak, but his voice came out as a raspy whisper. It wasn't supposed to be like this." He winced, his hand twitching at his side. Adam noticed something strange then. The man's hand, it wasn't just shaking. His fingers were bent at unnatural angles, as though they had been snapped and then healed in the wrong position. Adam leaned in closer, inspecting the patient's limbs, which were covered in bandages. His legs were dislocated, twisted in impossible ways, the bones clearly broken. "How did this happen?" Adam asked, his voice a mix of concern and professional curiosity. "Did you fall? Were you in an accident?" The man shook his head, and as he did, Adam saw a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air around him. A distortion, a flicker, like a television screen losing signal. Suddenly the man let out a sharp scream. "It's all wrong! Please, help me!" Adam was taken aback. "Calm down, Mr. Larson. We'll get you fixed up, okay?" But the man's eyes locked onto Adam's, and for a brief moment Adam saw something flicker behind them, a familiar expression that made his stomach churn with dread. "You're here, aren't you? You don't know, but you're here too." Before Adam could respond, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, followed by a crash. Adam rushed out into the hall, startled by the sudden noise. As he made his way toward the source of the disturbance, he passed several other rooms, each one housing patients with bizarre, inexplicable injuries. One woman's skin was burned in perfect circles, as though she had been branded by an unseen force. Another patient had a dislocated jaw, with no explanation of how it could have happened. Their eyes, when they looked at Adam, were filled with the same pleading desperation he had seen in Mr. Larson's eyes. The entire hospital seemed to pulse with a strange energy, the walls groaning under an unseen weight. The eerie quiet was broken only by the occasional gasp of pain or the distant murmur of a nurse's voice. When Adam reached the source of the crash, he found another doctor, one he didn't recognize, standing in the middle of the hallway. The doctor's hands were stained with blood, his clothes torn. He looked up at Adam with wide, fearful eyes. "You need to get out. You need to leave this place," the man warned, his voice trembling. "They're all trapped here. We're all trapped here. You don't understand. This place, it's not real. It's a prison." "Prison?" Adam repeated, confused and frightened. "What are you talking about?" The doctor took a deep breath, glancing over his shoulder nervously. "It's a rift, a tear in reality. The hospital, it's pulling people in from different timelines, from alternate realities. And once you're here, you can't escape." Before Adam could respond, the doctor bolted down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. Adam could feel the weight of the words pressing on him. The rift, a prison. Could it be true? As he returned to his duties, more patients arrived. Each one seemed more bizarre than the last. A man whose arm was severed but somehow still functional, as though the wound were a memory from another time. A woman who looked identical to someone Adam knew from his childhood. It wasn't just the injuries that were wrong, it was the patients themselves. Their faces seemed familiar, too familiar. Faces he could almost place from his own past. People he had known, but he couldn't quite remember how. He began to question everything, doubting his own sanity. Then it happened. Adam had a chance encounter with a nurse, a woman named Mary, who seemed to know more than she let on. She led him to a hidden part of the hospital, an old unused wing. As they passed the rooms, Adam's eyes were drawn to the mirrors that lined the walls. He glanced into one and froze. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. It was another version of himself, older, with dark circles under his eyes, a man who had seen too much. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered to the reflection, but it only stared back, unblinking. Mary's voice broke through his confusion. "You're not the first doctor to work here, Adam, and you won't be the last. This hospital is a place where time collapses. It feeds on the lives of those who enter, trapping them in endless cycles. And you're part of it now." The more Adam tried to piece together what was happening, the more fractured his understanding became. He found records of previous staff members, doctors, nurses, patients, all of whom seemed to have vanished without a trace. Yet there were also reports suggesting they had all been there before, countless times. The hospital was alive, a sentient entity, feeding on the lives of those it trapped. The patients were victims, yes, but so was he. Each day, the rift reset, erasing his memories and placing him back into the same cycle. He was reliving his first shift over and over again, each time unaware of the horror he was part of. Adam became desperate. He tried to escape, but the hospital wouldn't allow it. The doors led back into the same hallway, the same rooms. Each time he tried to leave, he found himself right back where he started. And then it hit him. He was never meant to escape. As the loop continued, Adam found himself becoming more and more aware of the pattern. He wasn't just trapped in the hospital. He was trapped within the rift itself. The hospital was pulling him from a different reality, a place where he had never been a doctor. The man in the reflection, the older version of himself, was the true Adam Carter. He was an unwitting participant in a twisted game of fate. In a final desperate attempt, Adam confronted the entity that controlled the hospital. He asked the questions that had been haunting him for days. Why am I here? What do you want from me? The entity's response was a whisper, a cold, insidious voice that echoed in his mind. I want you to remember. Every version of you has forgotten, but you are the key. You are the first, the one who will never escape. The lights flickered, and Adam's memories began to flood back. The countless shifts, the endless pain, and the knowledge that he would never break free. As the hospital reset once more, he knew the truth. He was trapped within an endless cycle, a doctor doomed to relive his first shift forever. And so, Dr. Adam Carter's story continued. Each time he woke up in the same hospital, on the same night, with the same patients and the same eerie sense of déjà vu. The cycle repeated itself endlessly, as the hospital, the rift, and the entity that controlled it fed on his life, erasing his memories and resetting the loop. He would never escape. It was just another quiet night in the Parker household. At least, that's what Emma thought as she sank into the comfort of her bed. She looked across the room at the sleeping figure of her husband, Mark, and the peaceful rise and fall of her daughter Lily's chest as she rested in the room next door. Everything felt perfect. The soft night air filtered through the window, and for a moment, Emma felt as though they had truly settled into this new life, in this new home, a place they could finally call their own. But that night, as she was drifting off to sleep, a sound broke through the stillness, a faint, almost melodic tune. It was so soft that Emma initially thought it was the house settling, the creak of old beams, a draft playing tricks on her mind. But then it grew clearer, louder, a lullaby. Emma strained her ears trying to place it. It wasn't a tune she recognized, yet there was something about it that seemed oddly familiar, something from a distant memory. At first it was a sweet, comforting melody, one that might have been played on an old music box. It was almost nostalgic in its simplicity. Her thoughts wandered as the notes continued to play until her eyelids grew heavy. Before she knew it, the lullaby had faded, and Emma had drifted into a deep sleep, though the song lingered in the recesses of her mind. The lullaby returned the next night, and the night after that. Emma tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the creaking of the house, maybe an old pipe or something settling in the walls. But as the days went on, it became impossible to deny the pattern. Every night, precisely at midnight, the lullaby would begin. Each time, it sounded eerily identical, though always at the same time, always at the same pitch, always perfectly in sync with the passing of the hours. The first few nights, Emma stayed in bed, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination running wild, a symptom of the stress from moving into a new home. Mark didn't hear it, neither did Lily, and that comforted Emma, even if only slightly. But on the fourth night, the lullaby was more pronounced, louder, as if the walls themselves were vibrating with the sound. Emma tossed and turned, her nerves on edge. Mark was asleep, his regular deep breathing unbroken. Emma slowly sat up in bed and listened intently. The lullaby filled the house with a strange energy, an air of something unnatural, something she couldn't yet put her finger on. Mark stirred beside her. "What is it, Em?" His voice was thick with sleep. She hesitated before replying. "It's that song again. I keep hearing it every night. It's getting louder." Mark, still groggy, rubbed his eyes. "It's just the house settling, babe. You've been listening to too many spooky podcasts." Emma chuckled softly, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure herself or him. "Yeah, you're probably right. I'll try to sleep through it." But that night, the lullaby didn't fade like it usually did. Instead, it lingered, its tones lingering in the air, even as Emma finally closed her eyes, trying to push the unsettling feeling back into the corners of her mind. By the end of the week, Emma could no longer deny that something was wrong. The lullaby persisted every night at midnight, but it was no longer the gentle, soothing song it had been. Now, it was distorted, twisted. The notes seemed to stretch unnaturally, growing louder, deeper, each repetition seemingly growing more sinister. Emma couldn't sleep. She lay awake each night listening to the song, her thoughts racing. She would often get up and wander through the house, hoping to find the source of the noise, but there was nothing, no source, no explanation. The house was as still as always, save for the eerie song. As the days passed, she noticed something strange happening with Mark. His once carefree, loving demeanor had started to shift. At first it was subtle, a distant look in his eyes, a distraction when she spoke to him, a brief moment of confusion when she mentioned something that would normally make him laugh. Then came the longer moments of silence between them. At dinner, Mark would sit there, staring at his plate, hardly touching his food. His eyes would occasionally glaze over, and Emma would have to call his name to snap him out of his daze. "Mark?" Emma asked one evening as they sat at the table, the lullaby ringing faintly in the background. "Is everything okay? You've been different." He blinked and looked at her, his face distant as if struggling to focus. "What do you mean?" I don't know. You're not really present. You've been zoning out a lot." He gave a half-hearted smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm just tired, Em. It's nothing." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The lullaby, the strange behavior, it was all connected. Emma spent the following day researching everything she could about the lullaby. She scoured old libraries, dusty online articles, and even local folklore to find a clue. And that's when she found it, an old, obscure reference to an ancient demonic summoning ritual. The lullaby was no ordinary song. It was the key to an old, cursed ritual used to summon malevolent entities, dark forces that were not meant to cross over into the living world. The song was designed to distort reality, feeding on fear and pulling its victims deeper into the supernatural abyss. Each time the song played, It would bind the listener to the entity, dragging them closer to the point of no return. The song wasn't just a melody, it was a portal. As Emma pieced together the information, she realized with growing horror that the entity was feeding off her family, warping their minds and their souls, inching closer to claiming them completely. It was too late. The curse was already in motion. Emma could feel the pull, the weight of the dark presence that now filled the house. It had begun to influence Mark, to twist him into something unrecognizable, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed Lily. Emma became frantic, trying to warn Mark, but he was no longer listening. Each day he grew colder, more distant. The lullaby played louder, echoing through every room in the house, sinking deeper into Emma's mind, filling her with dread. She couldn't escape it. There was no place she could go where the song didn't follow. She tried to protect Lily, to shield her from the growing malevolence, but even the little girl wasn't unaffected. She would wake up screaming at night, her small hands pressed to her ears, begging for the song to stop. "Mommy, make it stop," Lily would cry, but Emma was powerless. The house itself seemed to be a part of the curse, the walls themselves vibrating with the song's haunting tune. The very air was thick with an oppressive force that Emma could feel in her bones. It was closing in on her family. One evening, as the clock struck midnight, the lullaby reached its peak. The house felt like it was trembling under the weight of the song, and Emma knew that the entity was about to fully take over. Mark had stopped responding to her entirely. His once warm eyes were now blackened, hollow, his face gaunt and twisted in ways that didn't resemble the man she had married. She had to get out, but no matter where she went in the house, the lullaby followed, echoing through every corner, through every creak in the floorboards. She couldn't escape. She turned to find Lily, but the little girl was nowhere to be found. The shadows grew long and thick, twisting unnaturally along the walls. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, her pulse racing. "Lily?" she called out, her voice trembling. A soft giggle echoed from the darkness. The lullaby grew louder still, and there, standing in the doorway of the living room, was Lily, but she wasn't the same. Her eyes were wide, black, empty voids, her face blank and pale. She no longer looked like the innocent girl Emma had raised. The entity had claimed her too. "Lily?" Emma whispered, her heart breaking as she reached out for her daughter. But Lily didn't respond. Instead, she stepped aside, revealing Mark, or what was left of him. His form twitching, eyes blank, his lips stretched into an unnatural grin. "You shouldn't have listened," Mark's voice rasped, no longer his own. "Now, we're all a part of the song." Emma realized too late that there was no escape. The lullaby had consumed them all. It was not just a song, it was a curse, a never-ending cycle of torment and possession. She too would become part of it, her soul lost forever in the dark forces that had taken over her family. The lullaby played on, a permanent fixture in their lives, its tune the only thing left in a house that had once been filled with warmth and love. John Myers had always been a creature of habit. For years he'd worked long shifts at the factory, the night shift that seemed endless. When the workday was done, he'd leave the cold, sterile environment and take his usual route through the alley, cutting through a familiar stretch of darkness to get home quicker. The city streets were quieter at night, and John relished the calm, the lack of noise and people. It was his time to breathe, to unwind. But tonight something was different. John wasn't exactly sure what it was. Maybe it was the exhaustion weighing on him, or the dull hum of the factory still buzzing in his mind. He'd worked a particularly grueling shift, one that had run long into the night, and it left him feeling oddly unsteady on his feet. He turned into the alley without a second thought as usual. His boots echoed in the narrow passage, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls that were caked in years of grime. The flickering street light at the end was barely visible through the mist, casting a dull, sickly glow. John pulled his coat tighter around himself, wishing it would ward off the growing unease creeping up his spine. The alley, which he'd walked down countless times before, suddenly seemed off. It wasn't the usual deserted stretch of asphalt and brick. The air felt heavy, almost thick with something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the cold. It was more of a presence, something unseen but tangible, a sense that something was waiting, watching. He paused and looked back over his shoulder, half expecting someone to be there, perhaps a fellow late-night worker or a passing pedestrian. But the alley was empty. "Get a grip, John," he muttered under his breath, pushing on. But no matter how hard he tried, the unease refused to leave. The shadows around him seemed to grow longer, their edges darker, as though reaching toward him. For a moment he thought he heard something, a whisper, coming from deeper in the alley. But when he turned to listen, there was nothing, just the wind, low and steady. "You're tired. Just keep walking," he told himself. Yet something pulled at him, urging him to turn back. As he walked deeper into the alley, John's steps grew more deliberate. The flickering street light that he had relied on as his marker of the end of the alley remained stubbornly distant. He quickened his pace, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling as if an unseen hand were tracing the line of his spine. The alley was too long. It was never this long. It was supposed to be a brief, familiar passage, but tonight, the end of the alley remained just as far away as it had been when he started. John began to feel a sharp, unsettling tug in his chest, a gnawing discomfort that he couldn't explain. He glanced over his shoulder once more, his eyes searching the dark for any movement. He told himself it was just the darkness playing tricks, but the silence in the alley was absolute. No footsteps, no faint hum of the city, nothing. He continued walking. The walls of the alley, once familiar, now seemed to close in on him. The air was thicker, colder. His breath came in small puffs of fog, even though the night was warm. The alley seemed to shift around him, and the familiar concrete and brick walls twisted in strange, unnatural ways. He'd walked this route countless times, but now the path was unfamiliar, unrecognizable. His footsteps were loud against the silence, and each step seemed to echo back to him, multiplying until they filled the air with a deafening sound. His pulse raced as the alley stretched further before him, the end never coming closer. Panic began to rise in his chest, and he started walking faster, desperate to reach the end. But the more he walked, the farther the alley seemed to stretch. He stopped and looked behind him. The entrance of the alley was now completely obscured by shadows, a thick curtain that seemed to swallow the light. He could no longer see the street light where it once flickered. John's stomach dropped. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered. The alley wasn't just long, it was impossible. The silence grew oppressive as the shadows continued to stretch around him. He could feel it now, the weight of something watching him from the darkness, something ancient and hungry, and then he heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, like a breath on the back of his neck. He froze. His mind raced, trying to rationalize the sound. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was a figment of his exhaustion. But then the whisper grew louder. It became words, soft but insistent, calling his name. John. His breath caught in his throat. His name. He couldn't be sure, but he was certain. It was as if the voice came from all around him, like it was in his head. "Who's there?" John called out, his voice shaking, but there was no reply. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had started. John stood in the middle of the alley, heart pounding in his chest. His body screamed at him to turn around and run, but his feet felt heavy, frozen. The alley seemed to stretch endlessly before him, and it was now completely dark. The streetlight was gone, and the blackness pressed against him like a wall. He took a step backward, his eyes scanning the shadows. The darkness seemed to pulse, as though it was alive, and he felt a sharp, biting chill in the air. Another whisper. "John." It was closer this time. He spun around, but all he could see was the void. The alley, which had once been so familiar, was now a twisted labyrinth. The path ahead was no longer straight. It twisted and curved in ways that defied logic. It had changed. He had changed. A sound, soft but unmistakable, came from ahead of him. It was the sound of footsteps, but they weren't his. Heavy, deliberate steps approaching from the darkness. John's heart hammered in his chest, but the instinct to run didn't come. Instead, he stood frozen, staring at the nothingness ahead of him. And then, he saw it. A shape, a figure, emerged from the shadows. A tall, humanoid silhouette, its features obscured by the darkness. Yet something about it felt wrong. Its outline flickered like a broken image, shifting in a way that was both unnatural and disturbing. It moved toward him with a slow, deliberate pace. "Who are you?" John's voice cracked, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it continued its approach. John felt a pulse of dread surge through him, and for the first time in his life, he understood what true fear felt like. The figure emerged fully from the shadows, and John saw it in full for the first time. It was tall, far too tall, and its limbs were unnaturally long, twisted at impossible angles. Its face was dark, obscured by shadows, but its eyes, no, its gaze, was what terrified him the most. Those black, endless pits of emptiness stared back at him, hollow, consuming. It spoke again, its voice low, guttural. "You have entered my domain." John's throat went dry as he backed away slowly, his mind racing for an explanation. "No, this can't be real. You're not real," he yelled, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it stepped forward, its voice growing louder, reverberating through the alley like the ringing of a bell. "Real? You are real, John Myers, but you are now mine. Once you set foot on this path, there is no leaving. You are caught in my web." John's chest tightened. He reached for his phone in his pocket, but when he looked at it, the screen was black, no signal, nothing. The figure smiled, its grin wide and stretching too far, its teeth jagged and sharp. "You walked this alley as a shortcut," it said. "But there are no shortcuts here. There is no way out." John's heart raced. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. He had to escape. The entity loomed in front of him now, its dark energy pressing against him, suffocating him. The alley had completely changed. It no longer resembled the street he had known. The ground beneath his feet began to warp and writhe, the concrete shifting into something softer, like a living organism. He tried to push through, but the alley fought back. Shadows rose from the ground, wrapping around his legs, pulling him down into the earth. His body was becoming heavier, slower, as if the darkness itself was draining his strength. "Please, I just want to go home," John begged, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and rot, and John could feel the walls closing in on him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The figure towered over him, its eyes glowing now, reflecting the darkness of the alley itself. "You are home," the figure whispered, its voice filled with twisted satisfaction. And then John understood. This was no alley. This was no shortcut. This was a prison, and he was its newest inmate. John's screams echoed through the alley as the shadows closed around him, swallowing him whole. There was no escape, no end to the path. As the darkness consumed him, he realized the truth. Once you entered, there was no way out. The alley would never let him leave. Clara leaned back against the cracked leather seat of the taxi, her tired eyes scanning the darkness outside the window as the city sped by. The night had been long, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the kind of carefree conversation only friends can share. But now, the echoes of the party were nothing more than a faint memory, and the late hour had begun to weigh heavily on her. It had been a typical night out. She'd gone to a local bar, had a few drinks with her friends, laughed until her sides hurt, and then said her goodbyes. Her phone had buzzed with a few texts, but Clara had been too tired to engage. She'd opted for a taxi ride home instead, figuring it would be quicker than waiting for a rideshare. The streets of the city were always more alive at night after all. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as the taxi sped through the familiar streets. It was a route she had taken countless times. Downtown, past the old diner, the park with its broken fountain, and then the quiet residential block where she lived. In fact, this ride should have been no different than any other, but something felt off. It started with the silence. The taxi driver hadn't said a word since she got in. He was a middle-aged man, his face obscured by the rearview mirror as he focused on the road ahead. Clara wasn't used to silence in a taxi. Normally, the driver would make small talk, ask about her night, or comment on the weather. But this man was eerily quiet, his posture stiff and rigid. Clara glanced at the back of his head, trying to make out any distinguishing features. He had short, graying hair, a deep line running across his forehead, and a weathered face, but nothing about him seemed particularly noteworthy. Still, the silence gnawed at her. Her tired brain couldn't help but notice the unusual stillness that hung between them. The streets outside began to blur together, familiar landmarks passing by without registering in her mind. The city, which usually thrummed with the pulse of nightlife, seemed quieter tonight, almost unnervingly so. The once vibrant city felt hollow. The buildings were dark, their windows blank slashes against the night sky. It wasn't normal, but Clara couldn't quite put her finger on what was wrong. The driver's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles pale in the dim glow of the taxi's overhead light. His eyes, though, remained fixed on the road ahead, unwavering and emotionless. "Hey, are you okay?" Clara asked, her voice tentative, unsure why she was even asking. Perhaps just a desperate attempt to break the silence. The driver didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge her question. The unease settled deeper in Clara's chest. The city outside the window seemed to stretch endlessly now. The streets unfamiliar and twisted, as if the taxi were driving through some sort of distorted version of her home. A thought fluttered in her mind. Did I miss my turn? She looked at the landmarks outside again. There was nothing she recognized. The intersections, the buildings, none of them looked like the streets she had walked so many times. Clara swallowed hard, a knot forming in her throat. Something wasn't right. Had she been in this cab too long? She glanced at her phone to check the time, but the screen remained black. It wasn't dead, it just refused to turn on. She tapped the screen repeatedly, growing more frustrated, but it wouldn't budge. The taxi turned onto a narrow, dark street, one she was certain she'd never seen before. The buildings on either side were run down, their facades crumbling and covered in layers of grime. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the sidewalks. There were no pedestrians, no cars. It felt as though the entire city had disappeared, leaving her alone with this strange driver. The driver remained silent. Where are we?" Clara asked again, her voice quivering. This time, there was a hint of panic creeping into her words. The driver didn't answer. The taxi sped faster now, turning sharp corners and speeding down dark alleys. Clara's pulse quickened, and she shifted uncomfortably in the back seat. Her stomach churned. It was as though she was being drawn further into this unfamiliar world, the streets closing in around her. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice desperate. "Stop the car! This isn't my route!" But the driver didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. It was as though he hadn't heard her at all. The city outside continued to warp, more decayed, more alien, until Clara couldn't recognize a single thing. It was then that the real terror set in. The taxi came to a sudden halt, jolting Clara in her seat. The eerie, empty street outside stretched on infinitely, the buildings now towering impossibly high and casting dark shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe. The air had grown thick with an oppressive heaviness, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Clara glanced up at the rearview mirror again, this time locking eyes with the driver. His face had changed. His eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared at her with a vacant, unsettling gaze. His skin had taken on a grayish tone, as though the life had been drained from him. The familiarity of his features hit her like a punch to the gut, and she gasped. The realization slowly crept over her, like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. No, it couldn't be. Not him. Derek. It was Derek. The same Derek who had died in a car accident years ago. The same Derek who had been her close friend in high school, who had crashed on a rainy night, taken from the world far too soon. Her heart raced, panic seizing her body. The air around her grew colder, the chill settling into her bones. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Her hand scrambled for the handle, but it was as if the door had fused shut, refusing to release her. "Derek?" Clara whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Is it really you?" The man in the driver's seat didn't respond, his expression unreadable. The streets outside the taxi continued to stretch into the abyss, with no sign of life, no sign of escape. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as the realization took hold of her. She was no longer in the city she knew. This place, this twisted version of her home, wasn't real. Nothing was real. And Derek, her dead friend, was sitting next to her, driving her somewhere she couldn't escape from. The taxi lurched forward again, speeding down an endless road that Clara knew had no end. The city around her continued to decay, its once pristine buildings now reduced to dilapidated husks of what they once were. She tried to scream, to shout, to pound her fists against the window, but the sound was swallowed by the eerie silence that enveloped the taxi. The lights outside flickered again, casting strange, elongated shadows across the street. The buildings on either side appeared more like the remains of forgotten ruins, their windows shattered and their doorways black holes leading into nothingness. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on her, as though the entire world was being consumed by an insatiable void. The taxi's wheels screeched as it turned sharply, and Clara was thrown sideways against the door. Her head spun, and she fought to keep her breath steady, the weight of the situation growing heavier with every passing second. "Derek!" she choked out again, her voice shaking with fear. "Where are we going? What is this?" Derek didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. He simply continued to drive, his face expressionless and detached. His eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, remained fixed on the road, as though nothing else in the world existed. Clara's mind raced, her thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. She had to get out. She had to escape. She couldn't be trapped here, in this nightmare world. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in her apartment, safe and sound, ready to go to bed and forget the chaos of the night. But this wasn't real. None of it was real. The taxi sped faster now, the night stretching before them like an endless void. The streetlights were distant, flickering like dying stars. The city had become a twisted version of itself, barren, lifeless, and decayed. Then, the unimaginable happened. The buildings ahead began to shift and warp. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she watched in horror. The streets themselves seemed to twist, bending and stretching as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The taxi turned sharply again, and for a brief moment Clara thought she saw something in the distance. Something moving, a shadow. Number. It was too late. The shadow grew larger, and as it did, the world around her dissolved into pure darkness. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, each beat feeling louder than the last, as the taxi hurtled forward into the abyss. The darkness around them was no longer just a backdrop. It felt like it was alive, creeping in from all directions, swallowing the last remnants of the world she knew. Every flicker of light outside the cab was now an omen, a dying star in the blackened sky, signaling that something ancient and malevolent was closing in on her. And then there was the shadow. At first, it had been a speck in the distance, a movement in the blackness, a figure she couldn't quite make out. But now, it was growing, swelling like a dark storm cloud on the horizon, devouring the empty streets as it came closer and closer and closer. Clara could feel its presence, thick and suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. Her skin crawled with terror, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered, her voice breaking through the oppressive silence of the cab. Her hands gripped to the seat, her knuckles white from the force of her hold. The cold sweat beaded on her forehead as she glanced at Derek once again. He still had not acknowledged her, his face impassive and frozen, like a mask of some kind, a perfect replica of the man she once knew, but something far more sinister now. The shadow continued to grow larger. The world outside the taxi seemed to warp and twist as if time itself was bending around her. For a moment, Clara thought she saw a flash of her apartment building through the veil of darkness. A fleeting glimpse of her home, but it was decayed, broken down, and surrounded by an endless sea of fog. The windows were dark and lifeless, and the doorframe was cracked, as though someone, or something, had torn it open. Derek's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles pulsing with unnatural energy, but still he didn't speak. Clara's pulse quickened as the shadow loomed closer, its form becoming clearer now. It was not human, it was something far worse. A figure wrapped in darkness, its shape twisted and broken, as if it were something that should not exist. Its body was an abstract horror, parts of it flickering like the remnants of a half-remembered nightmare. The air in the taxi grew colder still, and Clara could feel the temperature plummeting. Her breath came out in quick, shallow gasps as she watched in terror, her eyes fixed on the monstrosity that seemed to be pulling the cab into its orbit. The shadow reached out, its tendrils stretching like dark vines toward the cab. Clara recoiled, trying to back away into the seat, but there was no escape. The darkness was everywhere now, wrapping itself around her, suffocating her, closing in tighter and tighter. "Stop, please!" Clara screamed, banging on the partition between her and the driver, her voice raw with panic. "Derek, please tell me what's happening. Why are you doing this?" The man in the driver's seat did not respond. His eyes were locked forward, unblinking, unfeeling. He was not the man she had known, not anymore. This creature before her, the thing that had taken Derek's form, was not alive, not human. It was something much darker. The darkness continued to press in, the shadow's tendrils now wrapping around the taxi's tires, pulling them further into the abyss. It was as if the cab itself was becoming one with the shadow, merging into the ever-expanding void. Clara's breathing became erratic as her mind raced. She struggled to think, anything, everything, to find a way out. Was this a dream? A nightmare? Was she dead already? And this was some twisted afterlife? The questions swirled in her head, dizzying her, leaving her disoriented and desperate. But then, in a single horrifying moment of clarity, she understood. This was no dream. This was no twisted afterlife. This was the final ride. Derek, or whatever had taken his place, had led her here, the place from which there was no escape. The place where souls were taken, swallowed by the darkness, lost forever. The cab lurched again, jerking violently as if something unseen had gripped it. Clara's hands flew to the door handle once more, her nails scraping against the cold metal, her strength failing her as the door refused to open. The shadow began to crawl up the sides of the taxi, its tendrils sliding across the glass, obscuring her view of the outside world. A whisper, a soft sibilant sound, echoed in her ears, a voice she couldn't quite understand. It grew louder, a chorus of whispers blending into one. Clara, Clara. Her name was being called. But it wasn't Derek's voice. It wasn't anyone she knew. The voice was ancient, raspy, 1,000 voices layered on top of one another, each one laced with despair. The more it called her name, the more she could feel the pull of the shadow, the hunger, the insatiable need to claim her soul. And then, a sudden realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She wasn't just trapped in this cab. She was trapped in a loop. The journey that had started innocently enough, a late-night ride home, was never meant to be anything but the beginning of a descent into hell. She had been chosen, pulled into this nightmare by the very thing that now gripped her in its dark embrace. Derek, her old friend, had died, and in doing so, had become a part of something far worse than death. He was the guide, the harbinger, the one who led others to the same fate. And now, she was here, in the final stages of her journey. The shadows consumed the world outside, and Clara realized with sickening clarity that she had crossed over. She was no longer in her world, no longer in the city she knew. She had passed the point of no return. The reality she had known was shattered, broken, and this taxi ride was her last. The taxi screeched to a halt, and Clara's body was thrown forward as the world outside dissolved completely, leaving only blackness. The faint sound of a door creaking open filled the air, and Clara looked up, her heart racing. She was no longer in the cab. She was standing in the middle of an unfamiliar place, a vast and empty void where nothing existed but shadows and the whispers of souls long lost. The faint glow of distant, dying lights flickered overhead, casting eerie glows on the cracked and worn ground beneath her feet. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice trembling. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was Derek, or rather, the thing that had once been Derek. The features were the same, but now his eyes were completely black, devoid of life. His body was pale, skeletal, as though death had already claimed him, and yet he stood before her, smiling in a way that made her stomach churn. "You are here now, Clara," he said, his voice hollow, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. "Just as I am, just as we all are." Clara backed away, her legs shaking beneath her. She had no idea what this place was, or what had happened to her, but she knew one thing for certain. She was never going to escape. Not now, not ever. "This is the end," Derek continued, his voice growing colder. "Once you step into the darkness, there is no turning back. You belong to it now." Clara's heart skipped a beat, and she turned, looking back at the dark void that stretched infinitely behind her. There was no path forward, no hope of escape, only the void, and the shadow that would soon consume her entirely. Clara's breaths came in shallow gasps as she stood in the center of the empty, lifeless expanse. The figure of Derek loomed before her, his form a twisted mockery of the person she once knew. His dark eyes burned into her, and his smile, unnerving in its coldness, seemed to stretch, widening slowly like a predatory grin that knew her fate was sealed. "This place," Clara whispered, her voice breaking with panic. She shook her head, unwilling to believe what was unfolding. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." Derek's hollow eyes glimmered with a faint glint of amusement, his gaze unblinking. "You still don't understand, do you?" he murmured. "You're already dead, Clara. You've crossed the threshold. There's no way back from here." Her mind reeled as she processed his words. Dead? The thought seemed absurd, impossible. She was standing here, right? Her body felt real. Her skin, her breath, the cold air that nipped at her cheeks. But beneath the layers of confusion, a dark seed of realization began to sprout. The distorted city, the warped taxi ride, The endless streets that had led nowhere, they weren't just a dream. This wasn't a random accident. It had been a journey, and now she had arrived at the final destination. "No," Clara whispered fiercely, shaking her head as if to dispel the words. "No, I'm not dead. I'm alive. I have to be." Derek's expression softened, but not in any way that offered comfort. His gaze held only pity, tinged with a sadness that was alien to the man she had known. "You're not alive, Clara. You're in between now, lost in a place where the living and the dead no longer matter." Clara stepped backward, her feet moving instinctively as she scanned the empty expanse. The ground was solid beneath her, but it felt as if it were shifting with every step. The walls of darkness around her seemed to pulse, moving, breathing, alive in some indescribable way. The air itself felt thick and suffocating, like a weight pressing against her chest. The whispers began again, soft at first but quickly growing louder, more insistent. She could make out snatches of words, though none were clear. Lost, never, here, forever. They slithered into her ears, worming their way into her thoughts. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice breaking, her hands reaching up to cover her ears, desperate to drown out the oppressive murmurs. But they only grew louder, sharper. The whispers weren't just in her ears anymore. They were inside her head. "You can't escape it," Derek said, his voice now carrying an edge of finality. "This place has already claimed you." Clara's heart hammered in her chest, the fear choking her as the shadows around her grew denser. The place was shifting, warping, as though the very fabric of the void itself was alive, folding in on her. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something powerful, pressing down on her from all sides, pushing her further into the darkness. Her mind raced. Was she truly trapped here forever? Was there really no way out? "Is this how it ends?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of despair. "A never-ending void, trapped forever." Derek didn't answer immediately. He stood motionless, his figure a silent witness to the vast emptiness around them. Then his lips parted, and he spoke in a low, soft tone, as if speaking to himself. "I used to think there was a way out too, but I've learned that this place isn't just an afterlife. It's a prison, and the worst part is that once you're here, you never stop yearning for the world you lost." Clara shook her head again, clenching her fists at her sides, refusing to accept this fate. She had to be able to do something. There had to be a way out. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the darkness swirling faster. The shadows stretched and recoiled, as if the very void itself were reacting to her defiance. Clara stumbled, struggling to maintain her balance. The whispers grew louder, and now she could hear their voices more clearly, each one distinct from the last. "Clara, Clara, come home. You can't escape. This is where you belong." Her pulse quickened as the voices surrounded her, their combined force crashing into her thoughts like a tidal wave. The shadows tightened their grip, their fingers like ice against her skin, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She struggled to free herself, but there was no escaping the pull. The more she fought, the tighter the shadows seemed to close around her, until she could barely breathe. And then, from the corner of her eye, Clara saw something, someone. A figure appeared, materializing out of the void. It was faint at first, a wisp of shadow, but it grew clearer as it moved closer. It was a man, his form gaunt and skeletal, his face pale and twisted with pain. He reached out toward her with bony fingers, his eyes wide and pleading. The figure stepped into the dim light, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was her father, but not as she remembered him. His eyes were empty, his face hollow, as if life had been drained from him long ago. "Clara." The voice was soft, almost tender, but it was coated with a sickening sense of finality. "You shouldn't be here." Clara backed away in horror, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and grief. "Dad, is it really you?" she cried out, her voice raw with emotion. Her father's form flickered like a dying light, his presence shifting as if it could disappear at any moment. "I was once like you. I thought I could escape this place. But there's no way out, Clara. The shadows will consume you. They take you piece by piece until there's nothing left." "No," Clara gasped, shaking her head. "I'm not like you. I'm not dead. I'm not like you. I won't stay here." Her father's figure stepped closer, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow. "You were never meant to be here, but now that you're here, you must face the truth. This place takes what it wants. We're all trapped in its grasp." Clara's legs gave way, and she collapsed to her knees, her breath ragged as tears filled her eyes. She could feel the coldness of the shadows creeping into her bones, draining her of everything that made her human. But then, in that moment of utter despair, something inside her flickered, a spark of defiance, something deep within her soul that refused to be consumed by the darkness. Clara lifted her head, her body trembling with a renewed strength she didn't know she had. "No," she whispered fiercely, the words escaping her lips like a vow. "I won't let this be my end. I will fight. I will not let this darkness claim me." Her father's form wavered, and for a brief moment, Clara thought she saw the faintest flicker of recognition in his eyes, a hint of pride, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the eternal sorrow of this place. As the shadows closed in, Clara rose to her feet, her fists clenched, her heart pounding with an unwavering determination. "I will escape," she said to herself, her voice steady and resolute. "I will find a way out of here." Clara's legs trembled beneath her as she stood in the eerie, desolate space, the shadows swirling around her like a living, breathing entity. Her father's ghostly figure loomed before her, flickering and wavering like a half-formed memory, his eyes full of sorrow and resignation. For a moment she had thought she might be able to reach him, to pull him back from whatever hell he was trapped in. But now, that hope was fading fast. She had to focus. She had to push through the suffocating weight of despair that threatened to crush her. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, each one clawing at her consciousness like 1,000 jagged nails. But Clara refused to let them control her. She refused to let this place take everything from her. "I won't stay here," she muttered under her breath, the words a quiet mantra. "I won't give in." Her heart pounded with each passing second, her mind racing. The dark void around her stretched endlessly, and the swirling shadows seemed to press in closer, feeding off her fear. They were waiting for her to break, waiting for her to give in to their influence. But Clara wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Her father's form seemed to flicker again, his hollow eyes locking with hers. His voice was barely audible, a faint echo in the ever-growing cacophony of whispers. "You can't fight it, Clara. It will consume you. The longer you resist, the stronger it becomes." Clara's stomach twisted in knots. the raw emotion in her voice threatening to crack. "I won't stop. I won't let this darkness win." She forced herself to look away from him, focusing instead on the shifting shadows that surrounded her. The air was thick, heavy with a stench that she couldn't place, an oppressive, rotting smell that seeped into her lungs with each breath. "Get away from me," she shouted, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. The shadows recoiled, but only for a brief moment, as though they were considering her challenge. They didn't retreat. They only waited, watching, listening for the moment when she would break. Her eyes darted around the void, searching for some kind of escape, some glimmer of hope. But there was nothing, only darkness and the whispers. No door, no path, no way out. And then, in the midst of her despair, Clara saw something, a light flickering weakly in the distance. It was small at first, like a tiny star in an endless black sky, but it grew, shining brighter with each passing second. She squinted, her heart racing as she realized it wasn't just light. It was something else, a doorway perhaps, or a portal. Without thinking, Clara pushed herself forward, her legs shaky but determined. She had no idea where this path would lead, but it had to be better than staying here, in this prison of shadows and whispers. She ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, the whispers growing louder and more frantic, urging her to stop, to return to the void. But Clara didn't listen. The light drew closer, and her heart pounded faster in her chest. She was almost there, just a few more steps. The darkness seemed to close in behind her, reaching out with cold, grasping fingers. But Clara didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Just as she was about to reach the light, something grabbed her from behind. Cold, clammy hands wrapped around her wrists, pulling her back. Clara screamed, struggling to break free, but the grip was like iron. It was too strong. "Let go of me," she cried, her voice filled with desperation. She kicked and thrashed, but the shadow that held her seemed to grow in strength, wrapping tighter around her. A voice low and guttural rumbled from the darkness behind her. It wasn't Derek's voice. It was something far darker, ancient, a force that had existed long before Clara had ever been born. The voice seemed to come from all around her, filling her ears and her mind. "You think you can escape?" it whispered. "You think you can outrun your fate? No one escapes the void. No one escapes me." Clara's body went cold as the realization hit her. This wasn't just a place of death. This was it, the heart of the darkness, the entity that had been controlling everything, the force that had lured her into this trap in the first place. The grip on her wrists tightened, pulling her further into the blackness. She struggled with all her might, but it was useless. She felt herself being dragged back into the void, the light slipping away from her grasp. "Let me go," she screamed, but her words were swallowed by the growing darkness. But then, just as the shadows closed in around her, something inside her snapped. No, her whole body tensed, every fiber of her being fueled by the last shred of hope she had left. She refused to let it take her. She wouldn't let it win. With a cry of defiance, Clara twisted her body violently, pulling her arms free from the shadow's grasp. She was free, if only for a moment. Without looking back, she ran toward the light, her heart racing. The shadows tried to pull her back, their tendrils reaching for her like clawed hands, but Clara didn't stop. She pushed forward, running faster than she ever had in her life. The light grew brighter, stronger, until it felt as if the very air itself was alive with energy. Finally, with one last desperate leap, Clara reached the light. When Clara's feet landed on solid ground again, she blinked rapidly, disoriented. The world around her was different now, brighter, warmer. It felt real. She was standing in what appeared to be her apartment, but something was off. The air smelled faintly of dust, and the furniture was slightly askew, as though someone had been in a hurry to leave. She glanced around in confusion. Was she back? But then her eyes fell on the reflection in the mirror. Herself. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she saw the woman staring back at her. She looked changed. Her skin was paler, her eyes hollow and dark, as if a part of her soul had been drained. Her hair was messy and unkempt, her clothes stained and torn. She looked like she had aged years in a matter of minutes. What was happening to me? The whispers returned, this time louder than ever, swirling around her in a dizzying frenzy. Clara covered her ears, trying to block them out, but it was impossible. The sound was overwhelming, crashing over her, filling her mind with confusion and dread. She staggered backward, her hand pressed to her head, trying to clear the fog that clouded her thoughts. Clara. The voice was familiar now, unmistakable. It was Derek's voice, but it was different, strained, desperate. Clara, you can't outrun this. The cycle, it's never ending. You're not the first. You won't be the last. Clara gasped, her knees buckling as she collapsed onto the floor. She looked around, desperate for an answer, but there was none. The world around her seemed to distort again, shifting like a mirage. In a final horrifying moment of clarity, Clara understood the truth. This place wasn't just an in-between. It was a trap, a loop. Once you entered, you could never leave. And now, Clara was part of the cycle. The darkness had claimed her, and the ride, the taxi, the void, the light, had been only the beginning of an endless journey. The whispers around her grew louder, more urgent. But Clara couldn't escape them. She couldn't escape the truth. She had become one with the shadows. David Harper woke up to a quiet house. The soft morning light crept through the curtains, casting faint shadows across the room. It was a normal morning, just like any other. But as he lay there, staring at the ceiling, a strange sensation washed over him. Something felt off. It wasn't a physical ache, like when you wake up with a stiff neck or a nagging thought that you've forgotten something important. This was different. It was deeper. Something inside him was missing. He shook the feeling off at first, just a passing moment of unease, a lingering dream perhaps. But as the days passed, it lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind like a persistent itch that couldn't be scratched. No matter what he did, the sensation didn't fade. It grew. David had always prided himself on his ability to stay grounded. He was a man of routine, work, family, hobbies. But lately it was as if the world around him had lost its vibrancy. The things he once loved, his morning coffee, the familiar sounds of his favorite music, felt distant, hollow. He didn't feel the joy he once did. Not even his reflection in the mirror seemed real. He stared at his face in disbelief. It was still him, wasn't it? But the expression, the eyes, it was as though someone else was looking back at him, a stranger. At work, he moved through the motions like a ghost. His colleagues' voices, their laughter, seemed muffled. He wasn't really there, not in any meaningful way. He was a spectator in his own life. The work he once enjoyed now felt like a monotonous chore, nothing more than an endless loop of disconnection. By the time the weekend came, David was no longer sure what was real. The unsettling sensation had taken root in his chest, a constant oppressive weight. He couldn't focus on anything. His passions, his relationships, they all felt like they belonged to someone else. Every conversation he had felt empty, every glance from another person indifferent. David's thoughts drifted to his girlfriend Rachel. They'd been together for 3 years, and things had always been easy between them. But now, even her presence felt like an echo. When they spoke, it felt as though he was observing himself from the outside. Her touch no longer sparked warmth in his chest. It was like the bond they had shared had eroded, leaving nothing but a hollow connection. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked him one evening, her brow furrowing with concern as she noticed the distant look in his eyes. David blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied, his voice sounding distant, even to his own ears. "Just tired." But the truth was, he wasn't tired. He was something else. He was empty. Later that night, David lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling again, the same gnawing sensation growing stronger with each passing hour. This time, it was different. This time, something inside him whispered, a voice, faint but clear enough to make him freeze in place. "You're losing yourself." David's breath caught in his throat. He was sure he hadn't imagined it. The words reverberated in his mind like a warning, and he felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. He sat up, heart pounding, scanning the room. It was dark, save for the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the window. There was no one here, just the hum of the air conditioning, the sound of his own shallow breaths. Yet he felt a presence, a weight, hanging in the air. Something other. His gaze fell on his hands. They were his hands, weren't they? He could see the skin, the scars, the lines, but they didn't feel like his hands anymore. They felt alien, and that's when it hit him. The nagging sensation. The feeling that something was missing, something important, something irreplaceable. He wasn't losing his mind. He wasn't simply depressed. Something was wrong. The voice came again, louder this time, as if it had broken through a veil. "Your soul is gone." The word sent a shiver through David's entire body, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, a spark of panic ignited within him. His eyes widened as the meaning of the word sank in. His soul. He had read about things like this, supernatural entities, possession, and ancient rituals, but he never believed in them, not really. It was all fantasy, fiction. But now there was something else, something deeply unsettling. He could feel it. A surge of dread filled him. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he felt it deep within his bones. His soul, his essence, had been stolen. David tried to recall the last few days, the last few weeks, to pinpoint when things started to shift, but the more he tried to focus, the more blurry the memories became. It was as if the moments were slipping through his fingers, evaporating like mist. But one thing was certain now. His soul wasn't just missing. It had been taken. His pulse quickened as he stood up, the room spinning around him. He had to find out who or what had taken it, and more importantly, how to get it back. If he didn't reclaim what was rightfully his, he would slip away entirely, vanish. He stumbled toward the door, desperate, but as his hand reached for the doorknob, A strange sense of déjà vu washed over him. He had done this before, hadn't he? But the thought was fleeting. There was no time for pondering. Not now. He needed answers, and he would do anything to get them. The days that followed were a blur. David's search for answers led him down a dark, twisting path, a path that threatened to unravel him further. His every waking moment was consumed with the gnawing feeling that something was wrong, that something was closing in on him. It was as if the world around him was decaying, crumbling slowly into nothingness. He scoured books, research papers, and online forums, desperate for a lead, anything to help him understand what had happened. It wasn't long before he found it. The mention of an ancient ritual, a dark incantation known only to those who dabbled in the occult. It was said that this ritual could sever the bond between the body and the soul, leaving the victim a hollow shell, a walking corpse. The entity behind this dark magic was an ancient being known as the Soul Eater. It was said to roam the edges of reality, feasting on the very essence of human beings. It was a creature from the darkness between worlds, and it had been doing this for millennia, stealing souls, leaving nothing but empty shells in its wake. David's heart raced as he read the grim accounts of people who had been claimed by the Soul Eater. They spoke of a journey, a descent into a dark alternate realm, a twisted place where lost souls were trapped, wandering forever. David's soul was trapped somewhere in that realm. With that realization, his determination grew. He would find this realm. He would confront the entity that had stolen his soul, and he would reclaim what was rightfully his. David's search eventually led him to a reclusive occultist, a woman named Margaret, who had lived for decades studying dark, forbidden knowledge. Margaret's house was on the edge of the city, hidden among trees and thick mist. She welcomed David into her dimly lit home, where ancient tomes and relics from 1,000 forgotten rituals adorned every surface. Margaret listened as David explained his situation, her eyes narrowing with recognition as he spoke. She didn't speak for a long while, but finally she turned to him, her voice grave. "You've crossed into the realm of the dead," she said softly. "The Soul Eater has claimed you, but there is a way to retrieve your soul. It won't be easy." She explained the ritual, the journey he would have to take to enter the alternate realm where the lost souls wandered. But the ritual required something more than just physical preparation. It would require a piece of himself, his very willpower, to guide him through the darkness. David nodded, his determination hardening. He didn't have much time. The longer he waited, the more his soul would fade, lost to the darkness forever. Margaret's study smelled like old leather and incense, the air thick with the scent of age and mystery. Every book, every scroll, every talisman seemed to hum with an unsettling energy. David had felt it the moment he stepped inside, a chill running down his spine as if the walls themselves were watching him. Margaret sat at a wooden desk cluttered with ancient texts. Her hands, steady and practiced, flipped through a large book filled with cryptic symbols and illustrations of arcane rituals. She muttered under her breath, tracing her fingers over the pages as if she were familiar with the words before they were even written. "You're lucky you found me," she said finally, her voice a whisper of authority that made David's skin prickle. The Soul Eater is no ordinary entity. It has existed since the beginning of time, feeding on the very essence of living beings. Once it takes your soul, it binds you to a realm beyond death, where time doesn't exist, where the rules of life and death blur into nothing. David shuddered at her words. How do I get it back? How do I retrieve my soul? Margaret's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. You must enter the realm where the lost souls dwell, David. A place where all those who have been stolen are trapped, twisted by the entity that rules over them. You'll need to perform an ancient ritual, a binding spell that will open the door to that realm. But the moment you step through, you'll be exposed to its darkness. The longer you stay, the more you'll lose yourself. David's throat tightened. But it's the only way, isn't it? Margaret didn't respond right away. She only stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. It is, she said, but you must understand. Once you're in, you may never return as you were. The soul's journey is one of peril. It will twist you, tear at your memories. You must be prepared to face yourself, your darkest fears, and the reality of what you've lost. David swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest, but he had already made up his mind. There was no turning back. Margaret stood, her frail body moving with surprising grace. She handed him a vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. The liquid shimmered faintly in the dim light of the room. Drink this, she instructed. It will prepare your mind and body for the ritual. It will open your senses to the realms beyond. And most importantly, it will allow you to traverse the barrier that keeps you from your soul. David hesitated only for a moment before uncorking the vial. The liquid was thick and bitter, coating his throat with an unpleasant taste. Almost immediately, his head began to swim, and a wave of dizziness crashed over him. The room spun, the edges of his vision blurring as his senses heightened. Margaret's voice echoed through the haze. Stay focused. Don't let the darkness swallow you before you even begin. Suddenly, everything around him went silent. The world around him seemed to dissolve, the walls of the room fading into nothing. David felt himself falling, as though he were slipping through the cracks of reality itself. The air grew thick and cold, and the darkness that surrounded him felt alive, pulsing, breathing, pulling him in. And then he was gone. When David's feet hit the ground again, he stumbled, barely catching himself. His surroundings were unrecognizable, a barren wasteland of twisted, crumbling structures that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. The sky above was an oppressive shade of black, with cracks of red lightning cutting through the air like veins in a dying body. A choking mist hung in the air, thick with the scent of decay. The ground beneath David's feet was cracked and uneven, as if the very earth itself had been torn apart. There was no warmth, no sunlight, only the cold, suffocating darkness that pressed in on him from all sides. For a moment, David stood still, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to adjust to the overwhelming feeling of displacement. This wasn't just a different place, it was a different dimension. A world entirely separate from his own, where the rules of time and space didn't apply. The air seemed alive with whispers, soft, distant murmurs that swirled around him, taunting him with words he couldn't quite understand. His body tingled and his skin crawled, as if the very atmosphere was alive with the lost souls that wandered through this forsaken realm. David. The voice was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the haze of his disorientation like a blade. He whipped around, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice, it sounded so familiar. David. This time, it was louder. And then, through the mist, he saw her, Rachel. But something was wrong. Her figure was distorted, her body barely holding together, like a fragile illusion on the edge of breaking apart. Her eyes were black pits, empty and soulless, staring straight through him. "No," David whispered, his voice shaking. "No, you're not real." Rachel smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was twisted, cold. "I'm real, David. I'm a part of this place now, just like you will be." David backed away, his pulse quickening. This wasn't Rachel. It couldn't be. The real Rachel could never look like this. She was trapped in this realm, just as he was, lost and twisted by the Soul Eater's influence. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice ragged with desperation. He turned and ran, the sound of his footsteps lost in the oppressive silence that followed him. He didn't know where he was running, but the instinct to move forward, away from the thing that looked like Rachel, pushed him onward. The whispers grew louder, the air heavier, as if something in this place was responding to his fear. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, and he stumbled into a cavernous chasm, barely catching himself at the edge. The drop was endless, the void swallowing any trace of light. From deep within the chasm, he could hear a low, guttural growl, as if something was lurking, waiting. David's breath caught in his throat. He had reached the heart of this realm, the place where the lost souls were trapped. He knew, with a sudden horrifying clarity, that the Soul Eater wasn't far. It was watching him, waiting. A shadow shifted at the edge of the chasm, and a figure emerged, a tall, gaunt shape with hollow eyes and a mouth full of jagged teeth. The Soul Eater. It was more than a creature. It was a presence, a force. The very air around it seemed to warp, bending and distorting as it approached, its long skeletal fingers reaching toward him. "David Harper," the Soul Eater rasped, its voice like nails scraping against stone. "You have come for what is mine." David's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood his ground. "I came to take back what you stole from me," he said, his voice trembling but firm. The Soul Eater laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the empty space. "You think you can reclaim your soul? You are already mine, David. Your soul is lost, and you are nothing more than a shell. You have crossed into my domain, and here there is no escape." David's mind raced as the figure advanced, but then something within him shifted. He had been a passive participant for too long, lost in his own despair, numb to the world around him, but not anymore. He had to fight, for himself, for the essence of who he was. He clenched his fists, his body trembling with determination. "I am more than a shell. I will not be consumed by you." The Soul Eater's eyes glowed with a cruel, mocking light. "Then prove it." David stood at the edge of the chasm, his heart thundering in his chest. The Soul Eater loomed before him, its jagged teeth gleaming with malevolent hunger, eyes dark pits that seemed to pull at his very soul. He was frozen for a moment, the terror of the situation threatening to overwhelm him, but a spark of defiance flared within him. "I won't let this thing take me, not without a fight." He stepped back from the abyss, but the entity's shadow seemed to reach for him, stretching impossibly long. The very air felt charged, suffocating, as if the atmosphere itself was alive and aware of his fear. The Soul Eater's voice, low and guttural, cut through the stillness. You cannot escape me. You have already crossed into my realm, David. You are mine now, forever. David's mind raced. He could feel the soul-crushing weight of the words settling in his chest. He had known from the start that this would be no easy task, but now that he stood face to face with the thing that had stolen his very essence, the full horror of the situation hit him with brutal clarity. He was in the grip of something far older, far more powerful than anything he had imagined. His memories of the world outside this place felt more distant with each passing second. His thoughts began to fragment, slipping between moments, as if the very fabric of his identity was unraveling. He needed to act before the Soul Eater swallowed him whole. "I came for my soul," David said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the rising panic. "You've taken it from me, but I will not be your prisoner. I will fight you until my last breath." The Soul Eater tilted its head, its smile spreading unnaturally wide. "Fight? You are already lost, David. Your soul belongs to me. The longer you stay here, the less of you remains. You will become part of this place, a shadow among the lost." David clenched his fists, refusing to show weakness. "I'll never let you win." In that moment, something inside David shifted. The despair, the numbness that had haunted him for so long, began to dissipate. The ritual had opened a door to this place, but it had also unlocked something within him, an inner strength, a force he hadn't known he possessed. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt the raw energy of his own will, fighting back against the darkness. The Soul Eater's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of doubt in its eyes. It had underestimated him. David's soul might have been taken, but the strength of his will remained, and in this world, that would be his greatest weapon. The air around him began to hum with power, crackling as if responding to his newfound determination. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, and the whispers of the lost souls grew louder, as though they too were urging him to fight. "You can do this," one voice whispered, faint but insistent. "Don't let it consume you." David's breath caught as he recognized the voice. It was Rachel's. But it wasn't the twisted version he had seen earlier. This was the Rachel he remembered. Gentle, kind, the woman who had loved him. No. "Rachel, help me," David whispered, reaching out into the darkness, his voice cracking. "Please, I need you." But the darkness around him only deepened, and the Soul Eater laughed, a horrible sound that echoed through the void. "You think your memories can save you? They are already fading, David. Soon, there will be nothing left." David's heart ached at the thought of losing everything, the life he had known, the people he had loved, all slipping away like sand through his fingers. He couldn't let it happen. He wouldn't. He forced himself to focus, to remember who he was. His soul, despite being torn from him, still had the power to fight. He recalled the words Margaret had spoken to him when she told him about the realm he had entered. "You must summon all your willpower and memories to battle for your soul's return." With that thought, something clicked. His memories were not his weakness, they were his strength. Every moment of his life, every good and bad memory, was a part of him, a part of the essence that had been stolen. And now, he would use them to take back what was his. David closed his eyes, focusing all of his energy on the memories of his life. The feel of Rachel's hand in his, the warmth of his childhood home, the sound of his laughter echoing in the streets with friends. As each memory flooded his mind, a pulse of energy coursed through him, pushing back against the oppressive darkness. The Soul Eater hissed, its form flickering with anger. "No, you cannot fight me with memories. They are weak." David's voice trembled, but it was steady with conviction. "They're not weak. They're mine." The air around David pulsed with light, and the dark chasm began to tremble. It was as though the very realm itself was reacting to his determination, to the power of his will. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was fighting. With every ounce of strength, David reached into the darkness, pulling his memories to him like a shield. The ground beneath him cracked open, and from the fissures, tendrils of dark smoke reached out to engulf him. But David was not afraid. He could feel his soul fighting back, sparking to life within him. "Get away from me!" David shouted, thrusting his hands forward. A burst of light shot from his fingertips, sending a shock wave of energy through the void. The Soul Eater recoiled, screeching in fury. "You cannot win!" it roared, its body convulsing as it stretched toward him. "You are nothing without me." David's chest burned with the fire of his own soul, the light from within him pushing back the dark. He took a step forward, refusing to give in. "I will not be your prey, not today, not ever." With a final primal roar, David summoned every ounce of power, every fragment of his essence, and blasted the Soul Eater with a wave of light that tore through the darkness. The entity shrieked, its form dissolving into a cloud of shadow and smoke, retreating into the chasm that had opened beneath it. The ground trembled violently, and the air hummed with the sound of destruction. The realm seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls of reality beginning to warp and twist, as if the very fabric of the world was tearing apart. David stood at the center of it all, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. The light from his soul slowly dimmed, but the oppressive weight of the realm was no longer there. The whispers had stopped. The darkness had receded. He had done it. He had won, but at what cost? The void had dissipated, and David found himself standing in a cold, desolate place. It was the same place where he had first arrived, the barren wasteland, but it felt different now. The air was still thick with the remnants of the darkness he had just fought, but it was quieter. He was no longer trapped in the twisted reality of the Soul Eater's domain. He felt it then, his soul, like a spark that had reignited within him. He was whole again. He could feel his essence, his true self, returning to him. But it wasn't as it had been before. It was fractured, altered. He stumbled, his body heavy, his senses dull. The battle for his soul had taken its toll, and the price of his victory weighed on him. His mind, once sharp, now felt clouded, as though something essential had been lost forever. He was alive, but not in the same way. David's hands trembled as he looked around. The realm was gone, the Soul Eater defeated, but the world around him felt foreign. He had returned, but at what cost? What remained of him, of his life, after everything he had been through? And yet, deep inside, a voice whispered, he had survived. He had faced the darkness and won. The very fact that he was standing here now, breathing, meant something. It meant that no matter how much he had lost, he was still David Harper. But was that enough?